Hello and welcome to This Day. I'm BJ Arnett, your host. You have a different type of life when you have an illness, a chronic illness that seems to reoccur out of nowhere, but you don't exactly know what it is. Well, I'm speaking with a lady right now who can tell us for herself what it's like to walk through something like that. And she is Debbie Kimberg. Debbie, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, BJ. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Debbie, talk to us about this tick-borne illness that you never really knew you had until you were an adult.
That's right. Actually, until my kids got diagnosed. That's when I found out, which is not uncommon for people who eventually go on to get diagnosed. And it all started when my youngest son, I have 3 sons, but my youngest had autism. And not a typical case where he couldn't make eye contact or say I love you, because he could do those things. But he was certainly on the spectrum, and it continued to get worse as he got older, had a lot of problems with learning, and ADHD and making friends. But eventually when he was 10, I had heard maybe we should take him to a functional doctor, which I didn't even know what that was. And when she saw him and looked at all of his tics and behavior, she said, you know what? He really needs to be tested for Lyme disease.
Did you know anything?
That's where our journey began.
Did you know anything about Lyme disease at that time?
Not at all. So I was born and raised my kids most of the time in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And I had never met a person diagnosed with Lyme disease. I really didn't know anything about it. I didn't know what it was or what the symptoms were, except that some people can get a really bad case like Yolanda Foster in the Housewives of Orange County, but that's all I knew about it.
The story really caught my attention when I read that first your young son, and then you, and then another son. How did this happen? Do you have a tracking, if you will, of how this even happened through your family?
Only retrospectively, like trying to put the pieces together. But my mom actually had symptoms, and we didn't know what it was. Like, she just had OCD, and she had anxiety, and that was really it. And just those couple symptoms can be a sign of Lyme disease. And then I had anxiety growing up when I was little, and I was kind of a temper tantrum-y kind of kid, and even as a teenager, I could be a handful of my mom. But people think of Lyme disease and they think chronic pain,
yes,
and can't get out of bed, fatigue. But there's so many symptoms. It can just be some psych symptoms: anxiety, depression, OCD, panic attacks, things like that. And it often over years, because it can be a low-grade chronic infection, can develop into autoimmune diseases. So things like thyroid, arthritis, lupus, ALS, IBD. So a lot of people can show with gut issues, fatigue, MS, neuropathy, fibromyalgia, so many different kinds of symptoms that people wouldn't even think about, hey, maybe that's Lyme disease. And then you have kids who have problems, and you don't connect it. It's in the data. If you look even on autism and do research, there's a lot of data about a lot of family members having autoimmune disease, but nobody's really put the pieces together yet.
And that is exactly what I was about to say. No one's put the pieces together, but further than that, as a parent, when our babies are ill, it makes us ill, because all we want to do is make sure our children are okay. Take us through your journey as a mom, as to once you found out this was happening in your son, and then click, we find out it's happening in you. How did you even navigate all of that at the same time?
Yeah, it's such a great question. It was a difficult journey, and part of the problem is that the CDC hasn't recognized this type of chronic disease yet, and so our doctors aren't trained on it. The CDC site isn't fully updated yet. If you look at something like LymeDisease.org, which all the Lyme specialists who treat every day, like that's one of their key sources of information. That has great information. But so it's hard because your doctors don't really know about this and they think it's rare because the tests really don't work, which is a big problem and probably why the CDC really hasn't got their hands around this yet. If you can't test for it, how can you talk about it? But so, we had to see doctors out of pocket because our insurance companies
don't even recognize it.
The CDC isn't recognizing it yet. Sorry, if the CDC doesn't recognize it yet, right, then insurance companies don't have to pay. And so we had those issues, but also, I'll be honest, it's very hard to treat. And so we focused on my son, on my youngest with autism, because we felt like he had the most amount of issues. And it took a very long time to find something that worked. And in fact, he was 15. So he was first diagnosed at 10, and then we didn't find anything that worked for him until he was 15. And so he was at the beginning of 10th grade when we started treatment that really worked for him is long-term antibiotics. And he went from reading at a 5th grade level at the beginning of the school year. Really, we were starting to look for long-term care services for him, residential homes, disability. But by the end of the school year, by the end of 10th grade, he was reading on track for 10th grade, and in 11th grade had moved out of special education. And so it's quite a remarkable story, and just goes to show you how important it is to get the right diagnosis, to keep digging, what's causing these symptoms, and getting to the right doctors and getting the right treatment.
I think of the fact that as moms, as women, we multitask constantly. And when we are multitasking, our children are right on that list. Our families are so important to us. But you had to navigate a thriving career as you're a financial executive and navigate taking care of your son. For it to take 5 years I can't, as a mom, I can't wrap my mind around that. But you had to do the research yourself.
I had to do a lot of research myself. There's Facebook groups, and we kind of help support each other. Instagram.
Oh, yes.
Because there's other parents going through it, but they're sort of the early adopters. I feel like we're the first ones who are really finding out about it and embracing it and really trying to figure it out. And some people are seeing a lot of success. It might take a while, but yeah, it's a huge challenge. You've got a job, and my job's been pretty demanding, but at the same time, to your point, I got to take care of my kid. This is my kid's life, and I got to do everything I can for him to make sure he's happy and healthy and living his best life.
And then you have the CDC that doesn't recognize this particular disease. Do we know why that is?
I think the fundamental reason is that the tests don't work. Right? Because if the tests don't, think about long COVID. Usually we think tests work, right? You go to the doctor, you get screened for, strep throat or pneumonia, whatever it is, those tests work. I think the first time in my life that we've really seen tests not work is with COVID, right? How many people took COVID tests? And we're like, oh, come on, I've got COVID. I don't care what that test says. But it's like that where, the tests don't work. And if they're going to stand behind the test and say that's the gospel, it's a huge problem. So there's a lot of Lyme foundations that are trying to work with the CDC to educate them. But I'm also personally trying to coalesce the autism community around this, because we're not the first, but we need more research. We need better testing, and we need the CDC to really dig in and figure out what's going on.
To really dig in and figure out what's going on and be able to give you, as a parent and as a community, relief, because this lack of knowledge on their part is certainly exasperating the situation. But now your son is how old now?
So he's 18. He's finished his high school next week, and we are so excited.
Oh, you're thrilled.
He got into a 4-year college, so we had him with a tutor all last year to prep for the ACT because he was really behind.
Of course.
Yeah, the low reading comprehension. I think a lot of that has to do with what we now think of brain fog. And these kids don't know they have brain fog because that's all they've ever known.
Right.
That's just how their brain works. But yeah, so he studied really hard, and he's going to University of North Texas in the fall, and it's just night and day where we were, 2.5 years ago. It's unbelievable.
The medication and the strategy that you're using now for better health for your son, you also had to take a part of for yourself, correct?
Yes, I am being treated. And I didn't even think I was a very serious case, right? Because I just had anxiety and thyroid. Mm-hmm. But it is a progressive disease, and symptoms will continue to develop throughout your life. It could be more autoimmune, could impact, dementia and other things down the road. So yeah, I'm like, if I'm going to ask my kids to treat, I don't care if I'm not that bad yet. I'm going to do this with them. So.
And at this point in the development of what you're doing for better health and your son going off to college, which I know is extraordinarily exciting with what you guys have been through, what do you see at the end of this road that, and within your walk in this whole situation, what do you see that would really break open to help parents to better navigate through illnesses like this? And I recognize that the tick-borne diseases, it's multi-layered.
Yeah. Maybe I can touch on that last point first. Like, people hear Lyme disease or tick-borne disease possibly, and they think, oh, it's Lyme, which is actually a specific bacteria called Borrelia that was identified in Lyme, Connecticut. That's where it got its name. But these insects, whichever ones, they can carry multiple bacteria, viruses, parasites. A single one can carry up to 8. There's 15 or more different kinds of infections that you can have. And so it's also a big problem, is making sure you get tested for everything, because it's not just one. And LymeDisease.org did a study a couple years ago, a self-reported study, but 50% of people reported having 3 or more infections, including Lyme, and a third had 4 or more. So just keep that in mind. And really, my advice is you've got to be your own advocate right now. And so do your research, join Facebook groups on children with Lyme, PANDAS, PANS. You can also follow me on Instagram. I'm at Hijack Brains. And there's definitely people in the community who want to help and get you in the right direction. And the first step is finding a Lyme doctor, which you can find in your state's Lyme Facebook group. That's where you're going to get the best recommendations.
And this is where social media becomes a very, very good help. This is where we need to dive into our social media, connect with others, get the information, go to LymeDisease.org, contact those, and very grassroots, boots on the ground. The more voices that are screaming the same thing, the more the CDC will have to recognize that there is a need, there is a place, there are people who are in need of a solution. And the solution cannot be just topical. It has to get to the root of the issue. Thank you so much, Debbie, for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your story.
Thanks so much for having me, BJ. It's been a pleasure.
God bless.